Kremlin has denied reports that President Putin and President-elect Donald Trump spoke on the phone. The Washington Post is saying that Mr. Trump spoke with the Russian president just hours after his election win last week, urging him not to escalate the war in Ukraine. But in the past few minutes, the Kremlin's leader's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, has denied that there was any call, saying it doesn't correspond at all to reality. It's completely made up. It's false information. There was no conversation. Well, according to the Post, Mr. Trump made the call from his Mar-a-Lago residence, where he's said to have reminded President Putin about the large US military presence in Europe and expressed interest in further efforts to end the war in Ukraine. Donald Trump's campaign team said that they would not comment on the reports. Here's our North America correspondent, David Willis.
I stop wars with phone calls. Russia should have never happened. With Ukraine, would have never happened if I were president. Would have never happened.
There's been uncertainty surrounding Donald Trump's intentions in regards to Ukraine, but it now appears discussions started only hours after his election victory. Reports of a conversation between him and Vladimir Putin last Thursday, in which, according to the Washington Post, the president-elect warned the Russian leader against any escalation of the conflict. Reports not denied by the Trump campaign, which follow a campaign pledge to end the war within a day.
Russia would have never happened if I were president. Attacking Ukraine would have never happened. I knew Putin, I knew him well, and I'll tell you what, I will have that war finished and done and settled before I get to the White House. As president-elect, I will get that done.
Mr. Trump is due to meet President Biden at the White House on Wednesday. The message to an incoming president skeptical about continued US funding from an outgoing one whose support was total: don't abandon Ukraine.
Our approach remains the same as it's been for the last 2.5 years, which is to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position on the battlefield so that it is ultimately in the strongest possible position at the negotiating table. And it should be up to Ukraine to decide for its own sovereignty and its own territorial integrity when and how it goes to the negotiating table.
As power is transferred, there are fears the conflict could escalate. This was the scene in western Ukraine after Russia launched one of its biggest drone attacks of the war so far. Ukraine is demanding NATO membership and the return of land annexed by Russia. Donald Trump has reportedly assured Ukraine's leadership of his support. But the question is, on what terms? David Willis, BBC News, Washington.
So what have we heard from the Kremlin? Here's our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg.
None yet. The Kremlin hasn't commented yet on these reports. We haven't had confirmation from the Trump transition team about the phone call. There's been no printout about the phone call, which wasn't organised via the State Department. That's the case, I think, with Donald Trump's other post-election calls with world leaders. All we know is what sources have told, for example, the Washington Post. In other words, that allegedly Donald Trump warned Vladimir Putin not to escalate the war in Ukraine and reminded him of American military strength in Europe. But as I say, the truth is we don't really know what the truth is about this phone call. What we do know, however, is I think there's concern in Kiev. Ukrainian officials publicly are trying to remain positive. President Zelensky was very quick to congratulate Donald Trump on his election victory, but there will be concern about what Donald Trump was saying in the run-up to the US election, his total lack of criticism of Vladimir Putin over Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. At times, Trump seemed to blame Joe Biden more than Vladimir Putin for Putin's invasion of Ukraine, claiming that if he'd been in the White House, Donald Trump, then Vladimir Putin wouldn't have invaded. And Trump was very critical about the scale of US military and economic assistance for Kiev, the tens of billions of dollars that America has sent Ukraine. Added to all of that, if you think back to September and what J.D. Vance, the Vice President-elect, was saying, he sort of sketched out what a peace deal for Ukraine could look like. It sounded very similar to what Vladimir Putin had been talking about. In other words, under that idea. Russia would get to keep the territory that it had seized already. There would be some kind of demilitarized zone, and Ukraine would have to sign up to neutrality. In other words, Ukraine would not be able to join NATO. If that's the kind of deal we're talking about over the next few months, that will not go down well in Kiev. But as I say, very few details in these reports of a phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin.
So our Russia editor there, Steve Rosenberg, and that we were speaking to him just before we got more details of that. Dmitry Peskov, Kremlin spokesperson, saying that, denying that there had been any call. So obviously a lot of unclarity, and we'll get to the bottom of it.